Thank you. Please be seated. Now, just before we commence, make a short statement. In order to comply with the reporting schedule, the Royal Commission proposes from time to time, and today is the first of such occasions, to conduct simultaneous hearings, and some examinations will take place before a single commissioner. This process is provided for in Section 7, subsection 1 of the Royal Commissions Act 1968. The Commissioner or Commissioners who have not been present for the examination of a witness will, as soon as practicable after the conclusion of the examination, consider the audio and visual recording and or the written transcript of the examination. If any Commissioner or Commissioners has questions arising from the consideration of the materials or from the examination generally, those questions will be delivered in writing to the legal representatives of the witness or to the witness if unrepresented, and the witness will be required within the time specified in the notice to provide written answers to the questions. The Commissioners may recall the witness for further oral examination, but will only do so where, having considered the written answers, they have formed the view that it is the only practicable way of resolving the issues raised. Accordingly, a witness will not be excused from further attendance and released from the effect of the witness summons at the conclusion of the oral evidence. Rather, the Commission will provide written notice releasing the witness if the Commissioners decide it's not necessary to enliven the earlier item about providing written questions, or the Commissioners are satisfied that that process has been completed. And unless an order to the contrary is made, written answers provided in accordance with this process will be made public. We will reduce that to a practice direction in due course with perhaps some modifications or additions, but at the moment that should be sufficient to advise the witnesses, the legal representatives and the public of the process of simultaneous hearings. Now, we have Mr. Dobson, I believe. Mr. Dobson, would you mind just giving us your full name for the record?
Stephen Mark Dobson.
And do you wish to affirm or make an oath?
I'll take the oath.
Thank you.
I, Stephen Mark Dobson, swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give to this Commission shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mr. Dobson. Please sit down. Yes.
Commissioners. Mr. Dobson, were you summoned to appear before the Perth Casino Royal Commission today?
Correct.
And the Commission provided with that summons a list of topics which will be covered during your examination?
Correct.
And the Commission invited you to prepare a written statement in relation to those topics? And do you have a copy of the statement which you prepared?
I do.
And have you read the contents of that statement?
I have.
And are the contents true and correct to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, they are.
Thank you, Mr. Dobson. Commissioners, I tender the statement of Stephen Mark Dobson dated 14 May 2021, which has the number GWC 0003.0009.0022.
The witness statement of Stephen Mark Dobson dated the 14th of May 2021 and bearing the document identifier that Mr. Sadler has just read out will be received into evidence as an exhibit. Thank you. Mr. Lee.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Dobson, I'm just going to open by asking some further questions in relation to your experience. So you explain in your witness statement that you have a wide range of qualifications and experience, and at paragraph 4 of your statement, you explain that you have an MBA from Murdoch University and a Bachelor of Business Financial Planning with distinction from RMIT. You don't indicate what years you obtained those qualifications. Was it before you began working as a financial planner in 1999?
No.
Can you let the Commission know when you obtained those qualifications?
So I completed the RMIT degree by distance education in 2008 and I graduated with the certificate in 2009. And the MBA from Murdoch University I completed in 2012 and graduated in April 2013.
Thank you. Then at paragraph 9, you say that you obtained your authorised representative licence from the Australian Securities Investment Commission in 2001. What is an authorised representative licence and what does it allow you to do?
So in 2001, it was called a dealer's representative under the old Corporations Act. So it allows me to basically operate as a financial planner.
And you've worked at Mel Dobson and Associates from 1999 until today?
Correct.
So you've been in that role essentially 22 years?
Yes.
You're a director of that business as well as a financial planner with that business?
Correct.
What does the role of financial planner involve in broad terms?
In day-to-day, it's assisting clients with goals, objectives to help them with their financial situation. That might be retirement planning, investment advice, life insurance.
And in that role, have you gained experience in the review and interpretation of financial documents?
Yes.
Are you proficient in interpreting and understanding things like bank statements, profit and loss statements and the like?
Within reason.
Then at paragraph 6 of your witness statement, you explain that you're a police officer between 2002 and 2008.
Yes.
Does that mean that you did the standard police training in 2002 at the academy, then afterwards probationary constable and then afterwards constable?
Yes.
And if I read your CV correctly, you were in uniform general duties between 2002 and 2007, and that you then completed detective training school in 2007, after which you were detective first class.
Correct.
Now, at any stage in that policing career, whether in general duties or as a detective, were you ever tasked to an area of the WA Police that dealt with financial crimes?
No.
Then you resigned from the WA Police Force in 2008 and worked for a period in 2009 for the Department of Fire and Emergency Services.
Yes.
And at all times during this, you were still doing consulting work with Mel Dobson and Associates.
Correct.
You then list other qualifications at paragraph 5 of your witness statement and also in your CV. Can you just let the Commission know when it was that you obtained your Australian Institute of Company Directors Diploma?
January 2011.
And lastly, your Introduction to Risk Management course with SIA Global.
I can't recall off the top of my head without looking at statements or old information, but it'd be 2013, 14.
Thereabouts. And what's the content of an Introduction to Risk Management course? What does it teach you or qualify you to do?
It was a one-day course I attended as part of another not-for-profit board I served on at the time, and it was basically formulating risk matrix and risk treatment strategies. So it was in the context of working in a not-for-profit environmental space.
All right, well, that question leads me to what I wanted to ask you about next, which is general board experience that you have. And you've listed quite a number of matters on your witness statement and your CV that I've had a look at. Putting aside your roles with the WA Police Football Club and the Jandakot Volunteer Bushfire Brigade, if I read that CV correctly, your first role as a committee member of an industry group was in 2010 when you were the Secretary of the Financial Planning Associate of Australia?
No, I was actually appointed as Secretary of a volunteer bushfire brigade when I was 18.
Yes,
and
putting aside the bushfire matter, is the first industry association for which you were a committee member?
Industry Association, okay, yeah. So that was a WA chapter, so not the Australian Financial Planning Association, but
yes,
just the WA chapter. I was the secretary for a short period of time.
And that was in 2010?
To 11, yeah.
All right, and then your first role as a committee member of a governmental organisation, was that in 2012 when you were appointed to the Small Business Development Corporation?
That's correct. I've been on other committees within Fire and Emergency Services, but that was my first formal board appointment.
Yes, and then you've subsequently been reappointed in relation to that role as the chairman in 2018.
Correct.
And you've otherwise been a member, if I understand your CV correctly, of 8 other governmental and industry committees or boards.
I'll take that as yes.
All right, but certainly an extensive number of committees and boards that you've been involved with.
Yes.
And in relation to the experience that you've now had on those committees and boards, do you consider that you have a good understanding of what is necessary for the successful operation of committees and boards?
Yes.
Including in relation to strategic roles such as organisational direction of boards?
Yes.
The coordination of planning, policies and decision-making frameworks?
Yes.
And setting values, standards and compliance expectations?
Yes.
All right. The next question I want to ask you, or series of questions to ask you, is in relation to you're being appointed as a GWC member, and that prior to that appointment, the qualifications you had as to the work that the GWC does. So I understand that you were appointed to the Gaming and Wagering Commission, which I'll often refer to as the GWC for brevity, only about 10 months ago on 1 July 2020.
Correct.
And prior to that appointment, you obviously had extensive experience in law enforcement as a result of being a police officer. But would it be fair to say that prior to that you had no experience in working for or being part of the directing body of a regulatory authority?
I guess not, no.
Is it also fair to say that prior to commencing work with the GWC, you had no experience in relation to the organisation or management of casino gaming?
Not casino gaming.
And then lastly, again, notwithstanding your reference to having worked at a racetrack, and this is at paragraph 8 of your statement, at Gloucester Park, would it be fair to say that prior to being appointed to the GWC, you didn't have any experience in the wagering or gaming aspect of racing?
Not in regards to the wagering, but in regards to the knowledge of the industry, yes.
Yes. And then more broadly, did you have any experience in relation to the wagering or gaming industry more broadly?
So I'd been previously a race horse owner and a member of the WA Trotting Association, and I'd grown up with it with my father and my late uncle owning trotters, and growing up in Jandakot, I knew a lot of harness racing drivers and trainers, so I'd met them through the course of my, growing up, and had a pretty good appreciation of that industry, but that's specific to harness racing.
Okay, so a good understanding of harness racing, but not more broadly wagering and gaming. Is that fair?
Correct.
Then just some questions in relation to training. You say at paragraph 20 of your witness statement that since being appointed to the GWC, you have not received any formal training as to the role of the GWC or your responsibilities as a member. Is that correct?
Correct.
Have you received any training?
No.
Have you sought any such training?
No.
Are you aware of any other GWC members who have sought such training?
I'm not aware.
What do you understand the position to be today in relation to the availability of training?
I don't think there's actually any particular bodies that would do training for the role that we operate in there as a commission. So I don't know of any. If there was training, I'd attend it.
Yes. Has there ever been, to your knowledge, discussions amongst GWC members as to whether that's the case, whether there is any training available?
I don't recall that discussion occurring.
And do you know if there's any training budget available for training of GWC members?
I'm not aware.
And lastly, in relation to training, have you ever been encouraged by anyone at the GWC, whether it be the chairman or anyone else, to seek out any formal training?
No.
Then some questions in relation to the appointment process for when you were first appointed. At paragraph 15 to 19 of your witness statement, you explain the sequence as to how that you came to be appointed. In summary, and please correct me if I've got this wrong, you previously uploaded your CV onto the WA Government's on-board register to indicate that you were interested in being considered for government roles.
Correct.
And on 6th of May 2020, you received an email from an advisor in the Office of the Minister for Racing and Gaming asking you to consider a position on the GWC.
Correct.
And then you've provided a copy of the email with your witness statement. And that email states, and this is GWC.003.009.002, that's a transcript reference only, I don't ask for that to be brought up. The email states that the GWC is responsible for regulating gambling and gaming activity in WA, and then it provided a link to the GWC's latest annual report. Is that correct?
Yes.
Did you have a chance to read the annual report?
Yes.
And then later that same day, you discussed this potential position with the advisor from the Minister's office. As a result of that discussion, what understanding, if any, did you then have as to the role of the GWC's work?
So I understood it to be the regulatory body that was responsible for gaming wagering. So that included the Crown, included community gambling and the gaming or the wagering activities of the racing industry.
And so that is in relation to, if you like, the scope of work that it would be responsible for. Did you at that stage have an understanding as to what the GWC actually did in relation to that scope?
Well, reading through the annual reports, I had a feel for what the work was involved, but I guess to be in more detail, without being inducted at that point, it was hard to know more.
And the advisor mentioned to you that you were considered to be potentially appropriate, or one of the reasons you were considered to be potentially appropriate was because of your law enforcement background.
Yeah, that's how I recall the conversation.
And also because of your broad board and governance experience. Did the advisor explain to you why it was that your background in law enforcement was seen to be relevant to or desirable for work on the GWC?
I don't recall.
Prior to accepting the role, did you have an opportunity to discuss with any other GWC members what the nature of the work was and what you'd be doing?
No.
Are you aware of whether any other GWC members were consulted on your potential appointment?
No.
The next questions I want to ask you about briefly are remuneration, and you indicate at paragraph 29 of your witness statement that your current remuneration for the GWC membership is $16,600 plus superannuation. Is that correct?
Correct.
I'm going to come in a moment to the sorts of work that you do, but just at a high level at the moment, do you consider that the amount of remuneration you receive is sufficient to properly compensate you for the amount of time that you have to spend doing the work of the GWC?
Prior to Royal Commission, yes. Post Royal Commission starting, no.
And looking prior to the Royal Commission commencing, do you consider that the current level of remuneration would allow for GWC members to take on more or do additional tasks than what they were already doing prior to the Royal Commission?
It depends on the individual board members' time commitments. For me, it worked, and I accepted the role based on the remuneration.
In relation then to induction, after being told that you'd be appointed to the GWC, your witness statement explains that you received various emails and forms in relation to that role, and you say at paragraph 22 of your statement that you read all of those materials, including statutes and regulations and the annual reports. When you say the statutes, do you have a recollection now as to which statutes it was that you read?
Gaming and Wagering Act, the TAB Act, looking at some of the other ones that were the more obscure ones. So I can't remember more of them off the top of my head, mental blank. But basically, I've got a link to quite a few legs and regs in that email, and I went through and read them all. I mean, it's impossible to take it all in, but I got a good idea straight away of what we are looking at.
And when you said you had a good idea straight away, do you consider that, whether as a result of your experience as a police officer or otherwise, you are reasonably proficient at being able to read and understand legislation?
Yes.
Just before you go on, can I come back to the question of remuneration? And you said, apart from the Royal Commission, that it's a sufficient level. Are you limiting, when you answered that question, were you limiting that to this Royal Commission?
Correct.
So what went before this Royal Commission, so before March of this year?
I deemed it to be appropriate remuneration up to that point.
Okay, thank you.
Then in your witness statement, you also say at paragraph 22 that you read the relevant web pages of the Department of Racing, Gaming and Liquor. I assume by that you mean the Department of Local Government, Sports and Cultural Industries?
Correct.
Again, for brevity, I'll generally refer to that as the department. Then you say at paragraph 23 that you attended the GWC offices where you collected an iPad.
Yes.
Where are the GWC offices, and are they different from the department's offices?
I visited 140 William Street, which is a large government building with multiple stories, and level 2 is the general reception, and that's where I met the department staff members. And then post that, I went to a floor that was much higher in the building and met with their IT security to reset passwords.
And in relation to the GWC offices, is that building that you went to, 140 William, is that where the GWC ordinarily meets to do its work?
Correct.
Then the officers that you spoke to, and you just explained to us a moment ago, you went through the security process, reset passwords and the like, and they showed you how to make use of the iPad, and they explained, as I understand it, that the materials relevant for the GWC's work would come up on the iPad. Is that correct?
Yes.
And were there any materials on the iPad already when you collected the device?
There were some board papers, there were some policies on there, there were some other documents that the previous user had still on there.
And did you have a chance to read through these other previous board papers and the like?
I had a brief read through, but didn't read. I think there was maybe 3 or 4 board papers that had been left on it.
All right. Then a few days later, after receiving this iPad, I understand that you made contact with Mr. Michael Connolly to discuss matters that were relevant to the GWC. Is that correct? Now, along with your witness statement, you provided an email dated 16 July 2020, and the transcript reference, that's gwc.0003.009.0016. If we could bring that up, please. And you can see there down at the bottom of the bottom part of the email, there's your email to Miss Emily Howell, and you've asked for an opportunity to meet the chair or the deputy of the GWC.
Correct.
And in relation to the names that you then use in the final sentence, happy to approach Duncan or Mick, how was it that you had come to understand which persons occupied the roles of officers on the GWC?
Through the discussions with Emily.
All right. And you then say at paragraph 25 of your witness statement that you did subsequently speak to Mr. Connolly. What did Mr. Connolly tell you about the role of the GWC, if anything?
It was a phone conversation. He explained the current issues that the board was looking at, that I guess the environmental landscape that we're operating in, discussions around some of the big picture items, which was the TAB sale, and in general, just an overview of what the Commission was doing at that point in time.
What, if anything, did Mr. Connolly tell you about the matters that fell within and without the remit of the GWC when it came to casino regulations?
Sorry, can you ask that question again?
So, did you, Mr. Connolly, speak about what matters the GWC did look at and did not look at when it came to regulating casinos?
I don't recall that part of the conversation.
At the time that you spoke to Mr. Connolly, were you aware about media allegations that had been made in relation to Crown?
No.
So you hadn't heard anything as to allegations that Crown Casino had been used for money laundering or had been involved with junkets with alleged criminal links?
I'd read it briefly in the media, but to be fair, I hadn't looked into it in detail.
Okay. Is that an issue which came up in the discussion between you and Mr. Connolly?
No.
You then say in paragraph 26 of your statement that you asked Mr. Connolly some questions arising from your review of the annual reports. Do you recall now what it was that you asked him and what it was that he told you?
Don't recall.
I've mentioned Mr. Connolly now. I'm just going to ask you some brief questions in relation to the issue of conflict of interests. This is something which you pick up in your witness statement at paragraph 38.3, and if we can please bring up page 8 of that statement. So in 38.3, you can see there that you say later 2020, Mr. Connolly disclosed that he had a conflict of interest. What was the nature of the conflict that he disclosed?
So prior to a board meeting, Mr. Connolly explained to the members that he knew Claude, if I get his pronunciation wrong, Moraes. He was a friend and a social friend, and they did fishing trips together, and that he was going to disclose that at the start of the meeting.
And when it was it disclosed as being something which was a conflict, or was a potential conflict of interest, if you recall?
I don't believe the word potential or real or any of those sort of contexts was used at the time. It was just disclosed to the commissioners.
Do you recall whether you'd ever heard about this relationship that Mr. Connolly had at any earlier time?
No.
How significantly do you consider, in the time that you'd been in the GWC prior to this declaration being made, how significantly did the work of the GWC depend on the work of Mr. Connolly?
He was a key staff member.
And how significantly did the work of the GWC depend on the exercise of Mr. Connolly's discretion and judgment?
Well, if it was day-to-day operational material, then that would be a matter for Mr Connolly, and the parts of importance would come to us for decision making that required the board's involvement.
After you learned of this declared conflict, did you have any concerns as to whether that conflict may have affected at all the discharge of Mr Connolly's duties?
No, I did not.
Did you have any view as to whether it may have had any impact at all on the work of the GWC?
I felt it put him in an awkward position after he made that disclosure to us, but I actually don't have any concerns as to his integrity as a person.
And just on that, while we're talking about him, more broadly, what was your view of the work that he performed for the GWC, the quality of the work, the nature of the work?
In fairness, I'd only been on that board for a very short period when that meeting occurred, where the disclosure was made, and it might have actually only been the second time I'd met him, because prior to that, Mr Connolly was in the Pilbara and the Kimberley doing the banned drinkers register, which, from my understanding and another board, is quite a substantial piece of work. So I like to be able to judge people after meeting them a few times, and it was hard to get I can't give you more answer to that at that point in time when that disclosure was made.
All right. I'm going to ask some questions now about the operation of the GWC board, and particularly your view as to how that GWC operates as an organisation, how it compares to other boards with which you've been involved. So at paragraph 31 of your witness statement, you estimate that each month you spend about 8 hours reading board papers prior to meetings and perhaps 3 to 6 hours attending meetings. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And again, understanding that things may have changed once this Royal Commission was constituted, prior to this Royal Commission being constituted, how does that workload compare to your experience with working on other boards, particularly other governmental boards?
It's comparable.
Comparable?
Yeah.
Is it correct to say that the agenda items for meetings of the GWC appear automatically on the iPads prior to meetings?
They appear on there, but also we get a Dropbox link. We receive an email from one of the executive staff to say that they're now available to be read.
And that after the meetings have completed, you then sent as well the minutes for those meetings?
Correct.
And who writes the agenda for the meetings?
I'm not sure.
Do you yourself or other GWC members have input into the writing of the agenda items?
Not unless there's a specific agenda item we want raised.
And how often has it been the case that there has been a specific agenda item that you want raised?
There might be something that flows on from, say, business arising, so from previous meetings, that might then trigger a new paper for the next meeting. But to my knowledge, there hasn't actually been, since I've been in there, hasn't been any out of sessions requests that have triggered a board paper to come up.
So, to the best of your knowledge,
Yes.
in the time that you've been there since October, the agenda has been solely put together by other persons, not the GWC members themselves?
I'd say, yes, that's correct.
The Commission's heard evidence from another GWC member to the effect that it's fair to characterise the approach of the GWC as reactive rather than proactive. And I don't seek to bring this up on screen, but just for the benefit of the transcript, the reference is page 75 on 13 May 2021 at line 40. That characterisation I've just stated, that the GWC is reactive rather than proactive, do you agree with that characterisation or disagree?
Disagree.
Can you explain to the Commission what your view is?
My view is that there's matters that they are actively working on in the background that would mean that elements of what they're doing are proactive, but in the most part, the papers are reactive. That's the nature of a government board, and I've been around them for a while now, and I've seen most how the other boards I've been on, most of the time it's going to be the same business each month that needs to be reported on, but where there is a one-off matter, so that needs decision, then the staff are proactive in their efforts to prepare a paper that would cover that, and it might be an emerging issue that needs a decision. So the examples, I can give an example of that if that helps.
Well, that would be useful, thank you.
Yeah, so recently there was an investigation into some community gaming matters, and in my opinion that was a proactive use of resources. The staff at the Commission actively conducted an investigation and brought before us papers, evidence, quite substantial amounts of paperwork that took into account what they were trying to achieve and for our input at the board meeting.
All right. I might segue from there with your comment about substantial amounts of paperwork, because the Commission's received copies of the agendas and the minutes of the GWC meetings. Would it be fair to say that those agendas are often quite voluminous?
Compared to other government board meetings, I would say they're actually on par.
Okay. I'm going to take you briefly to some of the matters that I've noted in the agendas of the GWC for meetings where you've been present, and ask you just to confirm that these are some of the matters which the GWC deals with.
Yes.
And the first is in relation to the approval of new styles of electronic gaming machines. If we could please bring up GWC.002.0016.0336 and at page 147. And then going down from here, you can see it says there this is an EGM presentation for Choi's Kingdom Link. And then going down for the next few pages, if you just keep going page by page for about 5 pages. So looking at what we're seeing coming up there, it's obviously a reasonably detailed explanation of an electronic game.
Yes.
I think it goes on for the next 60-odd pages. These sorts of presentations to the GWC, do they ask you to approve every electronic game that the casino seeks to roll out?
I believe so.
Also, is it right to say that the GWC also considers submissions as to whether or not there should be cancellation of licences of employees if those employees have breached conditions of their licence, for example, by failing to report a conviction?
Correct.
I'm going to ask for a document to be brought up, but can it please be brought up only on the screens of Council and the Commission, not the public monitors, because it does reveal a person's name. That's GWC.002.0016.0367 and at page 44. If that can be taken off the public screen, please. And just put up on the screens of Council and the Commissioners. Thank you. So we go to page 44. And you can see that there's a discussion here about potential disciplinary action for a person who has failed to report, I believe it's a traffic offence.
Yes.
Do you recall dealing with this matter?
Yep.
And the last thing I'm going to ask you about is the GWC dealing with relatively minor criminal matters that are alleged against the licensee. So if we can please bring up GWC.0002.0016.0314 and at page 45, please. And you can see here there's a discussion of an alleged incident of a juvenile being on the premises of the casino. And again, this is a matter that was brought to the full GWC for its consideration, then subject to a discussion at a meeting. Is that correct?
Yes.
Would you agree that these are the sorts of matters that are contemplated by Section 7A of the Gaming and Wagering Commission Act? And I'll just bring that up so you can have a look. That's pub.0004.005.0107 and at page 19, please. So you can see there it talks of the duty of the Commission to administer the law relating to gaming. Is that your understanding that these sorts of matters, which deal with the casino gaming, are contemplated by that provision of the GWC?
Yes.
Just in relation then to the relative seriousness of these sorts of matters, are you aware that the maximum penalty for a licensee having a child onto the casino premises is $5,000?
No, I'm not aware of those penalties.
Were you aware that the maximum penalty for a licensed casino employee failing to inform the GWC of a conviction is a fine of $500?
I can't recite all the penalties of the acts.
Were you aware that they were relatively minor penalties?
Well, they're penalties nonetheless. I'm not sure what the scope of it, they're minor or major, but I know there's penalties for all these offences.
Yes. Given what I'm suggesting to you as the penalty amount, the maximum 5,000 and maximum 500, would you agree that these are matters of relatively minor importance?
I'd deem them petty.
Petty, okay. In relation then to the fact that the GWC is tasked with dealing with those sorts of matters, which you've characterised as petty, how does that compare with your work on other government boards in relation to the nature of the work that's brought before the board to consider?
Well, the board's primarily meant to be there for strategic matters, not operational matters. So when I see that sort of paper coming before us, and bearing in mind I'm reasonably new to the board, I assume there is some context to why we're being provided that information.
Yes. And again, appreciating that you're new and that you perhaps haven't had time to form firm views yourself, is it your preliminary view that it's appropriate for the board to spend the amount of time that it does on the sorts of matters that you've described as petty?
If they're in the context of keeping appropriate casino licence holders to account, then it's appropriate we deal with them. But a juvenile on premises I don't deem to be something that is serious to warrant a board paper.
Have you or any other members of the GWC ever discussed potentially having these sorts of matters dealt with by officers of the GWC under delegated authority?
I don't recall those conversations.
What do you understand the position to be in relation to the GWC's use of delegations?
So there is a delegations process, which is pretty common across most government departments in regards to payment of invoices or day-to-day operational matters that don't need board approval. So there is a policy in force. I can't recall the exact wording. So,
are you aware of how many delegations are presently in existence?
No.
Are you aware of whether the GWC has a register of delegations?
But I'm going to say no.
And are you aware of how often delegated powers are exercised on behalf of the GWC?
There might be matters that come to us as a board where Mr Connolly or Mr Ord have noted that they've used their delegations to approve those, and I've seen those papers and matters before, but I can't recite what those areas are.
Moving on for a moment, you then say at paragraph 44 of your witness statement that GWC members also have the capacity to request a paper for a particular topic. Is that going back to what you discussed earlier when you were saying that it was possible to follow up matters between meetings?
Yes.
And I think, well, how often does that potential get used by GWC members?
Again, I mean, I can't recall the exact number of attended meetings, but I've been a part of it since July. So I would say there's been a couple of occasional, maybe 2-3 times that's occurred, but I don't recall exact numbers.
And then in relation to commenting on things prior to a meeting, what's the extent, if any, of pre-meeting contact between GWC members to work through preliminary views as to an agenda item or to discuss whether other agenda items would be necessary?
That doesn't occur.
At all?
Not to my knowledge.
All right, so you've never had contact with another GWC member out of session, out of meeting time?
In a social context, perhaps, but not to discuss matters because it wouldn't be proper because the commission chair is also, would need to be part of that discussion.
And is that, again, when you said it's not proper, is that your experience on other boards as well, that it's not discussed outside of session?
In my preference as a chairman of a government department is that matters for discussion should be brought before so all board members can have input. Opinions aren't formed prior to attending the meeting.
Turning then to the way the meetings are actually conducted. So procedurally, can you explain to the Commission how meetings work? And so just by way of example, is it the case that the chairman calls on the item, gives their point of view, then members have input? Is it some different way? Tell us how it works.
It follows a pretty standard agenda. So the agenda paper comes up, the chair welcomes the members, goes through, notes apologies, moves on to minutes, business arising, then agenda items 1 to X, and then general business, and then meeting closed.
But in terms of the way the agenda items are actually dealt with, so is it presented by someone? Does each member talk to it in turn? Or do members only talk if they want to talk? How does that work?
So if there's minutes, I guess, would be run through by the chair, and then if there's papers, say the financials, for example, then the chair or the deputy chair or Mr Connolly would run through those. Staff members have had the opportunity to question financials and bring in the staff and then drill into them, and we've certainly got 2 accountants on the board who have gone into detail on the financials. And other times there might be staff members that put up policy papers that would require to talk to the paper. So where it's a paper that needs to be spoke to, that staff member would come in and present to the board, but a lot of the time they, the chair would talk to the paper if it was something he was competent to talk to.
And in terms then of the discussion that follows the presentation or the chair introducing the item, how robust are the discussions that follow amongst the GWC members?
Robust.
Would you be able to give any further detail about that?
There's two-way conversation, opinions are considered, and if there is information to be clarified or more research required, then that's done. I wouldn't suggest that discussion is ever silenced or cut off. There's plenty of discussion and ample opportunity to do so.
And in terms of that level of discussion that goes on amongst the members, again, how would you say that compares to your experience in other boards and committees?
It's comparable. It's collegiate. There's no aggression and it's in polite tones.
Moving on then to the question of perhaps the strategic aspects or direction of the GWC, you say at paragraph 28 of your witness statement that your role is to have oversight of the GWC with regard to maintaining corporate governance of the agency. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then you add that generally the executive will come to us with their corporate plan and the GWC will provide the governance to ensure the agency is resourced and structured properly. And again, is this a role or a function that's universal across the boards that you've been involved with?
Yeah.
In relation to the issue of resourcing, you then say at paragraph 42 of your statement that the department supports the GWC by providing resources, staff and buildings, and that they also provide officers who monitor and investigate Crown and report to the GWC on those investigations. Is that right?
Yes.
The next paragraph, paragraph 45 that follows after that, you then say that the support from the department appears to be limited. Can you just give some more detail about that to the Commission, please?
I say it appears to be limited from a brief period on the board that I haven't seen a huge number of staff, only the ones that have presented to the board. And I say that in the sense that we don't have our own staff member per se that is our executive officer that just works for the board, which is how I've seen it work in other agencies. And also, that's on my opinion of seeing what I would call stress levels within staff members.
You have seen stress levels of staff members, is that right?
Yes.
Is that something which you've seen since you started, or is that a recent matter?
Since appointment to this board.
And have those stress levels been constant since the time you've started, or have they been increasing or decreasing?
So just to be clear, this is talking about staff member stress levels.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So, well, I would say it's consistent.
Now, in relation to the resources, you indicated that they're limited and that staff are stressed. But previously, I read you the portion of your witness statement where you said that the GWC will provide the governance to ensure the agency is resourced and structured properly. So is there an issue with the GWC not ensuring that there's sufficient resources available if there are people who are stressed?
Sorry, can you ask that question again, please?
So you've explained to us that resources seem to be limited and that staff seem to be stressed.
Yes.
And I took you earlier to a portion of your witness statement where you said that one of the roles of the GWC was to ensure the agency is resourced and structured properly. So if resources are limited, is the GWC, at least in the time that you've been on the GWC, has it perhaps not been able to successfully resource the agency?
I can only give my opinion and say it doesn't appear to be well resourced based on my opinion of looking at staff members in their presentations to us and the post-meeting discussions around their workload. And I would say that when I talk about resources, I'm primarily talking about staff resources, human resources, which appear to be overworked.
Yes. And in relation to those staff and human resources, are you aware of the fact that the GWC approves the annual budget for the agency?
I'm aware they do it. I haven't been through a budget cycle yet, though, as a board member.
All right. My understanding is that you did vote to approve the 2020-21 budget in August 2020. Do you recall that?
I don't recall that. If it's in the papers and I was there, then I assume I did.
All right. Well, can we bring up GWC.0002 2019-0016.0310, and please go to page 157. So do you recognise this format of document?
Yes.
And what do you understand it to be?
It's the cover sheet for the budget.
All right. Looking at that now, does that ring a bell for an item that you may have seen?
It does.
All right. And do you recall that the resolution of the GWC was to approve the budget that was then stated?
That appears correct.
All right. I can take you to the minutes where that's done, but if you're happy to accept that, all right. And
But just ask, do you know Stacey Blackman?
Not personally.
And do you know what position that person holds?
No, I don't. I believe she might be the financial officer, and this might go back to the commentary I mentioned earlier about the two accountants on the board, and I believe it might have been Stacey or one of her other staff that presented to this topic. But I just say that in the context, this is my second meeting at the board,
yes.
so I'm still finding my feet.
Yes, of course. Are you aware of whether the board has taken or has discussed taking any steps to increase the level of support that it can provide, or the level of resources that it can provide for the agency?
I don't recall those conversations.
And can we call up, please, pub.0004.0005.0107 and go to sections 18.1 and 18.2. If we can have those side by side, please. Now, have you previously had a chance to look at these sections of the GWC?
Yes.
And do you understand, well, what's your understanding of what those sections provide for?
So it basically gives the Gaming Commission the power to take on additional staff and or delegate authorities and investigations to public servants or other state government agencies that can assist.
So in relation to that, and in relation particularly to where it says in paragraph 18.2 that the arrangement for staff under 18.1 is to be made on such terms as are agreed by the parties, are you aware of whether there's been any negotiations for such an arrangement?
No, I'm not aware.
Are you aware of what the current terms of the arrangement are?
Is in term you mean time frame or term as in conditions?
Well, in terms of, do you know what the arrangement provides for by way of staff or resources for the GWC?
So to my understanding is there is an element within the GWC budget that is provided to the department to provide staff to execute the duties of the GWC.
And in terms of that provision of staff, do you know how many staff are provided?
No.
Do you know the conditions under which they're provided, such as their pay?
No.
Is this something which is ever discussed, to the best of your knowledge, amongst members of the GWC?
No.
In relation then to your earlier comment about resources being limited, do you consider this as something which the GWC could investigate to potentially seek further resources or redirect the way that resources are currently allocated?
It is possible they could do that.
All right. Moving away then from the budget issues and going to document GWC.001.007.0187. Do you recognise that document, which is headed Board Essentials, as being one of the ones you were provided when you commenced with the GWC?
I don't recall if it was provided or not, but I've read it before in my context of other government board roles.
All right. If we can please go to page 2 and the fourth paragraph down. Starts with, in general, boards are responsible. You can just read that.
You want me to read it aloud?
Oh no, just to yourself.
Okay, yeah. Yes.
So in particular, the comment there is the fact that boards are not responsible for day-to-day operations. Is that something which is consistent with your understanding from the work that you've been involved in with other boards?
Absolutely.
And how well do you consider that the GWC operates in accordance with that principle?
Prior to this Royal Commission being called, and from my limited involvement, I didn't have any concerns.
Okay. In the final sentence of page 2, you can see down that it says, as a board member, you're responsible for familiarising yourself.
Sorry, which?
Final sentence of page 2, down the bottom.
Oh, you gotcha. Yep.
And again, is that consistent with your understanding as to your responsibility on other boards?
Yes.
And do you consider that you have been properly supported by the GWC more broadly in terms of coming to understand your responsibilities on the GWC?
Say yes.
Then if we can go to page 6. And in the second paragraph from the bottom, you can see there's a recommendation that the board considers producing a statement of intent in response to a statement of expectation.
Yes.
Do you know whether either such statement exists in relation to the GWC?
I'm not aware.
And do you know whether the GWC members have ever discussed potentially seeking such a statement to explain or guide the GWC role?
No.
Then the last paragraph of the page, if we can bring that up, please. You can see that suggests that ministers should be regularly informed of relevant matters. Is that
Yes.
again consistent with your experience on other boards?
Yes, by the chairperson though.
If we can go now please to page 25. And you can see there the heading that says governance principles.
Yes.
Now going down to 1, there's a principle that says roles and responsibilities are clear and understood. And I'll just let you read that paragraph.
Yes.
So, short question, how clear do you consider the roles and responsibilities of the GWC to be, and do you think there is that understanding amongst the GWC?
Sorry, I'm going to have to ask that question again, please.
So, do you consider that the roles and responsibilities of the board, individual members and so on, are clear and well understood?
Well, they're in statute, so to a degree, yes.
And do you consider that in the time that you've been operating with the GWC, it's been always apparent to you the nature of the work that the GWC is entrusted with performing?
Yes.
Looking at the remaining criteria, if we can have this page and the subsequent page side by side, please. Just take a moment to look through each of those 7 criteria. And then afterwards, please indicate to the Commission whether there's any in particular that you consider whether the GWC does or does not meet.
Perhaps I can talk to each of the numbered points. Would that be simpler?
Of course.
So point 3, the board has strategic focus, agreed. Point 4, relevant risks are identified and managed, disagree. Point 5, control systems have integrity and support accountability, agree. They're in public sector regulations and relevant laws. A culture of responsible and ethical decision making is promoted, partially. Board operates effectively in the scope of the board with the exclusion of the chairman, I believe, yes.
All right, so the 2 that you've identified as potentially issues, number 4 and number 6, can you explain in a little more detail what you consider the problems to be and tell the Commissioners whether you have any suggestions as to how that might be improved in the future?
Sorry, so which points again, sorry?
So I think you told us that you disagreed with 4 and you partially disagreed with 6.
Yeah.
So if you can now tell the Commissioners some more detail as to why you have concerns in relation to those points and if you have any suggestions for how to address those concerns.
Well, I think in regards to the gaming industry, it's emerging and there are continual changes, particularly in the online space. And so the risks that are known that appear before the board are somewhat historical ones, and emerging and proactive risks would require further work, and to my understanding that work to identify and plan for those risks has not occurred.
I might have missed it, but I didn't hear you comment on 1 and 2 at the bottom of the previous page.
Apologies, Commissioners. So would you like me to go back to 1 and 2 first?
Just 1 and 2, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So the roles...
You the terminology was agree or disagree or partially.
Yeah. So to 1, I would say agree. To 2, I would say agree. Would you like me to continue with those other ones?
You would just, is there anything further you wanted to add in relation to either 1 or 2 for the Commissioner's benefit? Is there anything further that you think might be relevant to work on this inquiry?
I mean, whether it's going to come up further in the evidence or the questions that the Chair and the CEO is one and the same is a pretty redundant model, and I trust that will be eventually amended in regulations or statute.
And when you say it's a redundant model, what do you mean by that?
There is no independence to the person's role, and a chairperson should, in my experience, be separate to the CEO / Director General of the department.
Okay. Is there anything that you wanted to say in relation to number 2 as to the structure and composition, as to whether there's sufficient expertise, and diversity?
There's definitely diversity, and the board members are very experienced and competent people. I don't have any doubts in that regard. And I think the challenge is that if the Commission was seeking to look down the path of where to find people who have relevant gaming experience and be willing to take on a board role, the pool of resources and human resources in that regard is very limited, particularly by jurisdiction, because we'd have exactly the same scenario we'd have with Mr Connolly, which is where those relationships would be difficult to actually maintain and control. So potentially have to be something similar to how the CCC recruit investigators, where you'd go cross jurisdiction, so there can be little chance of conflicts of interest. But there just isn't, in my experience, enough people with governance experience in casino regulation, and that's our challenge as commissioners. I haven't worked in a casino and I don't know all the rules of gaming, and so we can only go on the advice of staff. So in that regard, if there was to be some independent thought, which a board should have, and it wouldn't have to be all members' subject matter expertise, because it'd be a pretty one-sided board, but it should see experience across a wide range of things such as accounting and legal. But there is going to be a massive challenge there to fill that gap.
Then we had earlier been talking about number 4, and you had said that you had some concerns that the board's focus was somewhat historical and there wasn't perhaps as much focus on emerging problems, and you gave online gaming as one of those issues. How does that then fit together with point 3, which is whether or not the board has a strategic focus? Are you saying that it does have strategic focus, but more on a historical nature of issue?
The strategic focus is really sticking to what the annual report and the objectives are, but I don't see any micromanagement of operational matters, so that's why I believe we are a strategic focus board.
All right, then you said that you hadn't any concerns in relation to point 5, but you said you had some partial concerns in relation to point 6. Can you explain that in some more detail?
Well, I guess with the benefit of hindsight, the disclosure by Mr Connolly is a concern for myself, and perhaps I should have asked further questions when that disclosure was made, but bearing in mind it was only a few meetings in, I was still finding my feet, and I didn't want to come in like a wrecking ball and have a crack at people before I knew more to the story. So at that point in time, it was a bit of a concern. And then at a later date, I was to discover that Mr Ord had done his own inquiry into that disclosure, and I was disappointed to be told that at a meeting rather than be told up front as a board member that was occurring.
So does that feed into point 7 then, where it says board operates effectively? Do you consider that was an instance where perhaps the board didn't operate as effectively as it might have?
The board would have operated effectively if we were told, but the chairperson did that on their own volition without communicating it to other members.
Yes. I'm thinking of the chairperson as being a member of the board as well.
They are, but they're also, that's their day-to-day job. So I talk about board members in the sense of those people that are doing other jobs in their lives, and then they come in to make decisions once a month.
Yes. And in terms of what you're explaining now, that you were essentially a bit disappointed by that process, Do you know whether that was a view shared by other GWC members?
I can't comment for them.
Unless the Commissioners have any further questions, then I was now intending to move to some questions on policy work. So in relation then to Section 7 of the Gaming Wagering Commission Act, and would please bring that up as PUB.0004.005.0107. And if we can go to sections 7 and then have the next page side by side as well, please. So we looked at section 7.1a earlier. Had you previously been aware of subsection BA or 1BA, which talks there about formulating and implementing policies?
It's in the Act. I don't recalling those exact words, but it seems to be a duty that would be responsible for.
And looking then, I think it's over the next page at 7F, 7.1F, I beg your pardon. In relation there to advising the Minister.
Yes.
And lastly, if you can look at section 7.1G, and there the duty of the Commission to make certain recommendations.
Yes.
So in respect of those things that I've just taken you to, since you became a member of the GWC, are you aware of whether there have been any policies promulgated by the GWC as contemplated by section 7.1BA?
I don't recall.
Are you aware of the GWC generally making recommendations to the Minister as to the control or supervision of gambling?
I believe they have and continue to do, but I don't recall it occurring during my time on the board.
And then lastly, are you aware of, again, since your time on the board, the GWC making any recommendations as contemplated by section 7.1G?
Well, I guess the initial start of the inquiry was an area that we were going to look at. So when we were discussing as a board how to act in regards to the outcome of the New South Wales inquiry, that was utilising those powers to the Minister.
All right. Putting aside this particular inquiry or what's now led to this inquiry, are you aware that the GWC has discussed otherwise doing any of those things that are listed as part of its duties?
I don't recall.
Moving on then to what you referred to at paragraph 38.2 of your witness statement, a review by Ernst Young. And you explained that the scope of the review was to provide assurance to the GWC that its legislative responsibilities in respect of gaming are being fulfilled and that GWC officers have appropriate processes and practices in place to meet all of its legislative responsibilities. Do you have that?
Yeah.
Am I correct in understanding that because the GWC was seeking that sort of review, it had some concerns that its legislative responsibilities were not being fulfilled?
The Chair put this paper to us to say that we're going to do a review in the context of looking to our roles and responsibilities as an agency, say as in us, as in GWC, and that it would report back. And it wasn't seen to be, it was somewhat a brief paper that we considered.
Did the Chair explain why it was that he considered that such a paper might be a good idea?
He said it was good governance to look at this review and undertake this process, and it seemed on face value to be okay to me.
So did you understand it as being essentially something which was proactive rather than responding to something?
Absolutely.
All right. You have also then included as an attachment to your witness statement an email chain from Ms Hewson, and that's gwc.003.009.0019. And starting on page 3, you can see the original email from Ms Hewson to you.
Yes.
She explains the objectives of the audit.
Yes.
And then a second dot point, she talks about an assessment as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Then in response to that, you send another email back, which is at page 2. You can see the second dot point there on that email. where you say that this appears to be something new that you don't recall. Do you remember writing that email?
Yes,
Is it that you don't recall COVID-19 being discussed at that meeting at all, or that you didn't recall it being discussed in relation to the audit review?
I don't recall it being discussed in the scope of an area that the audit review was going to look into.
All right. And then there's some text in blue underneath, which gives an answer as to how that was suggested.
Yeah,
And that obviously suggests that the Director General was a person who suggested the inclusion. Had the Director General, prior to you receiving that email, explained to any of the GWC members that he might be making that suggestion?
I don't recall that occurring. That's why I asked the question.
And obviously, it's not a unilateral decision because it's seeking GWC member input. But how did you feel about the fact that what was now being suggested or proposed did not align with what had been discussed, as to the best of your recollection, at the meeting?
I was disappointed. That's why I wrote this email, to clarify and find out more scope of what was actually being involved.
And you say you were disappointed. Why is that?
Because the scope of this work seems significantly different to what we approved as a board paper. Hence why I asked these questions about the scope, the fees. There was no scope, there was no fee estimate put to us as a board to consider. And so I asked the question, as you can see at point 3, about the scope and why and what the cost was going to be. So it's a job as a probing director is to ask those questions.
Yes. If you can then please take this to page 1 of this document. And you can see there the final email in the chain, or the most recent email in the chain at the top, where you asked for a conference call to be arranged regarding the paper.
Yes.
Was a call ever arranged? To the best of your knowledge.
I don't recall now, to be honest.
Okay. Then, just more broadly on the question of the powers of the Commission, obviously this audit review was looking at those legislative responsibilities. If we can please bring up GWC.0003.009.0017, and this is an email where there's some additional discussion or communication about the GWC's powers or role. And you can see that there's a reference to general information about powers to undertake an investigation.
Yes.
Do you recall what the circumstances were that led to this email being sent to the GWC?
I don't recall.
Now, the date's 26 October 2020, so that's quite shortly after you joined the GWC. Do you remember what sort of matters were then being discussed by the GWC prior to this email?
Is it possible to have a look at the board agenda for the meeting of the 27th of October? Because that might put into context why that paper was put.
I think we'll try and arrange that for you over the morning break. In the meantime, I'll just bring up GWC.0003.009.0018. Do you recognise this document as being the attachment to that email?
Yes.
And taking a moment to look at the first dot point in relation to the Commission's power to undertake investigations, and then the second dot point, what the investigations could be in relation to. Now, in relation to the nature of the investigations that can be carried out, you'd agree that the explanation that's provided here doesn't suggest that the investigations are limited in any way, that there's no areas which the GWC cannot look into in relation to gaming.
Agreed.
At paragraph 41 of your statement...
Just before you leave that document, Mr Dobson, I'm going to come back to these issues later in the day, but I'm interested in, you've referred to, it's a strategic board with a focus on strategy. And I'm always interested as a matter of nomenclature, what people understand by strategy and strategic in this context. When I look at that list that's on the screen now, that seems to me to be nuts and bolts.
Correct.
How does that fit into your notion of strategy?
It doesn't. It appears that we've been given powers to recommend investigations or be involved more operationally in that decision-making process.
All right, thank you. I will come back to it with that clarified thing.
So I was just about to take you then to paragraph 41 of your witness statement. And that's where you say that, based on information provided to you in your tenure, you understood that money laundering investigation sits outside the GWC remit in terms of statutory responsibility.
Yes.
Where does that understanding come from?
So as a financial planner, I've done qualifications, training and continuing professional education in regards to money or AML requirements and knowing the client, knowing the source of the money, those sort of areas. And as my understanding is, we're, from that industry I work in on a day-to-day job, that is a federal government agency that primarily takes carriage of that called AUSTRAC.
But obviously, we looked a moment ago at section 21A and that summary of those powers that were given to you. And I think you agreed that there was nothing in that summary which suggested that you were limited from looking into those matters as the GWC. Is that correct?
Correct.
And as a former police officer, you understand, or do you understand the distinction between investigating a matter for the purpose of gathering evidence in relation to that matter, potentially prosecuting that matter, as opposed to investigating a matter because it might be relevant to some other issue that you're looking at?
So yeah, I understand both those statements.
And would you accept that part of the role of the GWC is to, amongst other things, advise as to the suitability of persons who might be licensees holding a casino licence?
That appears to be within the brief and the legislation of what we operate within.
Yes. So on that basis, and perhaps understanding, as you said, that the Commonwealth authorities are responsible for investigating, perhaps prosecuting AML type offences, did you understand that there was any prohibition on the GWC looking into matters such as money laundering if it was relevant to questions as to a suitability of a licensee?
If it came up and it was recommended to the board that we commence an investigation into that, then I'd endorse that.
All right. Commissioners, that might be a suitable time.
Thank you. We'll come back at 11:25. Thank you, Mr Dobson. Yes, Mr Lee.
Thank you, Commissioner. Now, Mr Dobson, just before the break, we had been talking about some matters relating to, first of all, an Ernst Young report, and then prior to that, in relation to an email providing you information as to the powers of the Commission. Now, during the break, I understand you've had a chance to briefly look at the agenda for the meeting immediately preceding that email about powers. Having done so, is there anything that you'd like to tell the Commissioners about as to what it was that was the genesis of that email?
It appears, looking at the agenda, there was a presentation from Crown executives in regards to some ongoing matters that required our decision or at least guidance, and that paper looks to be a refresher of powers for the Commissioners to be across.
Do I take it from that you considered, or that the GWC considered, that depending on the nature of the presentation, it might be necessary to exercise some powers?
When it was sent in advance, I was of the thought process that we're going to be asked to make a decision in regards to something like that, but it was, here's your powers just in case you forgot.
All right. Then we discussed briefly the audit report, or the proposed audit report, and we went through the emails where you had raised some concerns about a potential change in scope. The change that was being proposed by the Chairman appears to have been to add an additional item for review. Did you understand it that way?
That's how I read it to be.
What was the concern as to adding an item as opposed to perhaps deleting an item that the GWC had wished to consider?
Well, any amendment to the scope that we had agreed on as a board, in my opinion, should be brought back to the board, or at least to be put out of sessions to the board for consideration.
And then some of the other questions that you raised in relation to the potential report were in relation to budgeting and the cost of the expanded scope. What was your understanding as to who would pay for that report?
I assume it was going to come out of our budget.
And did you at that stage have any view as to the capacity of the budget to absorb that expense?
No, I didn't. That's why I asked the question as to what the cost was going to be.
All right. And then last question in relation to that review report. Are you aware of whether that review report has been finalised?
I don't believe so.
You haven't received a copy of anything since then?
I've seen an interim PowerPoint document.
In relation to the Ernst Young review?
I believe it's interim.
I'm sorry?
I believe it's interim.
And do you recall what it was that you received, that PowerPoint presentation?
Oh, I can't recall exactly. In the last week and a bit, 2 weeks perhaps.
Thank you. After you've had that meeting in October that we've talked about earlier, where you received the email as to your powers, a few months after that point, do you recall the GWC resolving to inform the Minister of a matter? And that was in relation to a November 2020 meeting?
I don't recall that exact matter.
Can we please bring up GWC.0002.0016.0335? And if we can go to page 7, please. If we could please turn off the monitors that are visible to members of the public and bring up the unredacted document only on the tables or on the monitors of the Commissioners and Council. Actually, I beg your pardon. Please don't bring up for a moment. I might just read a paragraph to you and ask you if this triggers any recollection. So this again is the minutes for the November 2020 meeting, and there's a statement as follows. In respect of the ILGA inquiry, the Chairman advised that he will write to the Minister to provide comfort that the Commission is engaged with the inquiry and is satisfied with the actions currently being taken by Crown Perth, brackets, withdrawing from junkets and no longer accepting cash deposits, close brackets, whilst it awaits the outcome of the ILGA inquiry in February 2021. Do you recall that being said, or that being part of a discussion at one of the GWC meetings?
Yeah, I recall that being an action that the Commission agreed to.
Do you recall why it was that it was considered appropriate that the GWC should write to and update the Minister?
It's appropriate as the chairperson to update the Minister on something that was considered contentious.
And so in relation to something that was considered contentious, is that just broadly in terms of the matters being considered by ILGA, or was it something specific?
I think it was in regards to the inquiry in New South Wales, because there was in the interim there was no action from us as a commission, as in we weren't changing or doing anything, and it would have given the Minister comfort that we had a plan of attack, which was to wait for the inquiry results to come out from New South Wales, and that was the advice we received from Mr Connolly and Mr Ord, was to wait. We don't want to jump the gun and make recommendations that could already be made in that inquiry.
So when you say you had this recommendation from Mr Connolly and Mr Ord, did the GWC then discuss this recommendation and agree that was the appropriate way forward?
I don't recall the exact conversations, but if it's in the minutes, then I can only say that occurred there.
Do you recall why it was that it was said to be perhaps a preferable option to wait for the ILGA inquiry rather than taking any steps on your own?
Because from what I understood, we didn't want to make any changes in advance, knowing that the Crown operated in multi-jurisdictions. So we didn't want to make any changes here that might go at odds as to what the recommendations were going to come out. And it seemed to be just a prudent approach to wait for that inquiry to take its course and then make recommendations as a result of that.
Are you aware of whether any letter to the Minister was sent?
I don't recall.
You didn't see a copy of anything, go, to the best of your recollection?
To the best of my recollection, I don't recall seeing that letter.
And do you recall whether there was any notification as to a response being received from the Minister in relation to that, if there was any communication?
I don't recall.
Now, the next thing I want to ask you about in some detail are materials that the GWC received prior to a meeting on 15 December 2020. So if we can please bring up GWC.0002.0016.0345 and just stay at page 1, please. Now, just looking at that document again, do you recognise it or recognise the format of it?
Yes, I do.
And do you have a positive recognition of this being the matters that were to be discussed at that 15 December 2020 meeting?
Without going over to page 2 of the agenda, it looks to be pretty accurate.
Can we call up page 2, please, and have that side by side?
Thank you. Yep, I recall being there and those items on the agenda.
All right. Now, before we go and look at the content of the detail of those individual agenda items, I'm going to show you the minutes of the meeting first and ask some questions about that. So can we please bring up GWC.0002.0016.0346. And do you agree that those are the minutes for that meeting?
Yep.
And that, as the minutes suggest, you were there in attendance? And
yes.
Do you have an actual recollection of that yourself?
Yes.
Now if we can go to page 9, please, item 12.5. Now, just read paragraphs 1 to 3 for yourself, please, and let me know when you're finished.
Yes.
Paragraph 1 talks about papers being received after hours last night and the document being circulated. Do you recall that late circulation of papers?
Yes, I do, because it was real late.
If we can please bring up GWC.0001.0010.0002. So do you see, in relation then to the email, it appears that there's something that's been forwarded from, via Mr Connolly first and then from Jocelyn Stevens to all the members of the GWC?
Yes.
Do you recall actually getting this email?
Yes.
And obviously you can see that from the time, it's only sent at 5:23 p.m.
Yes.
And it appears to have an attachment. You can see the name on that screen there, 2012-14. I won't read the rest of it. Do you recall having received that email, whether you had an opportunity to read that attachment and the materials provided with it prior to the meeting the next morning?
No, I skimmed it. I skimmed it that night.
And when you say you skimmed it, does that mean that you essentially went through the entirety of it, but at a high level?
Yes.
Now, if we can go back again, please, to gwc.002.0016.0346, and again at page 9. Thank you. Now, looking at those paragraphs, and in particular paragraph 3, that seems to indicate that there was actually Crown persons at the meeting to talk to those documents that we've just looked at. Is that correct?
Correct.
And that the submission they made was concerned with governance arrangements and internal reform.
Yes.
Now, if you look at paragraph 4, it says that they also gave an update on new anti-money laundering training.
Yes.
So am I right in understanding that that presentation that they gave was on multiple matters, not just confined to one topic area?
Yes.
And in the second paragraph, there's some timing explanation as to when it was that those persons from Crown joined the meeting to make their presentation.
Yes.
And you can see it says there at 10:37 a.m. Do you recall them entering the meeting while it was commenced?
I do.
And then at paragraph 5, it shows they left at 11:14 a.m.
Yes.
So in total, they would have presented for approximately 35 minutes. Is that right?
Yes.
In paragraph 2, it also shows that Ms Coonan joined the meeting, and Ms Coonan, I understand, to be a member of the GWC. Is that? Oh, I beg your pardon. That's is Ms Coonan the chair of Crown?
Crown Resorts chairman.
Thank you. And she also joined by Teams.
Correct.
And then lastly, at paragraph 5, is in relation to persons leaving the meeting again, all those persons leaving at approximately the same time. And the final paragraph is that member Katie Hodson-Thomas left also at that same time.
Yep.
Am I correct in assuming that members wouldn't have discussed amongst themselves their views as to the presentation while the Crown persons were still joined to that meeting?
That's correct.
So does that mean that Ms Hodson-Thomas left without taking part in the discussion that followed the presentation?
That's correct.
Do you have any recollection as to why it was that Ms Hodson-Thomas left immediately after the presentation?
I don't recall why she left. It would have been personal.
When you say personal, is that something which was another personal matter she had to attend to, or whether she, for example, had a conflict of interest or anything else to that effect?
Oh, no, but I believe she had another appointment or another meeting. Katie's on a couple of other boards as well, so she's quite a busy person. But I think there might have been a minute or two gap in between the Crown executives departing and Katie departing. I don't recall the conversation or the scope of it.
All right. So then going, now you can see down the bottom of that page at item 13, and it says the meeting was declared closed at 11:50 a.m.
Yes.
So with persons having left at 11:15 or thereabouts, that would have left you approximately a half hour to discuss the presentation that you had then seen. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then at paragraph 6, I believe it is, there's an explanation as to what members talked about after the presentation, saying they discussed the Commission's response to date and the information provided by the Crown reps. It's not clear from that statement whether the information provided there is referring to the written documentation that had been provided the night before, or in relation to the oral presentation that had just been witnessed by the GWC members. Do you recall whether you spoke about both presentations?
Well, if I can put it in my own words, what happened was they presented to the meeting. Coonan spoke through the presentation and went through the PowerPoint slides, and it was a very professional report. And in fairness, once we had time to go through it with her on the screen, we probably got a better appreciation for what they were trying to convey than us trying to read that report, because it was a lot, well, not report, PDF, which was converted from a PowerPoint. Barton sat next to me, and he added bits and pieces throughout the conversation, but primarily it was driven by Koonan as chairperson from the Teams screen.
All right, so you said that it was essentially a PowerPoint type presentation which had been changed to PDF.
Yeah.
But does that mean that they were coming up as slides as opposed to, for example, a letter?
Yeah, there were slides. That was my recollection. It was like a strategic overview. These were all our key changes, talking through it. I mean, I assume it's been provided in minutes, but it was quite detailed about all the strategic changes they've been making as an agency or as a listed company in terms of changing all their processes, protocols, new governance staff they brought in, and that included a fellow, the name escapes me, that had been recruited from National Bank to head up their investigations and money laundering aspects of their business. So Koonan spoke to all that. And it was actually a really, in my opinion, a very clear presentation.
So once that presentation was concluded, we've looked already at the comments that it makes in the minutes as to what was then discussed by the GWC. And there's a comment at paragraph 6 saying that members agreed to direct the Crown not recommence junket activities without prior approval. And then in the box underneath that, in terms of the resolution, there's a resolution both as to ceasing junket directions and as to amending licensing requirements.
Yes.
So those are all matters that were discussed by the GWC in that half-hour period following the presentation.
Yes.
And can you, obviously it's reasonably brief in terms of what is presented in the minutes, can you let the commissioners know whether you have any further recollection as to what was the content of that discussion leading to the conclusion by the GWC that it was appropriate to issue a direction to cease junket operations or amend licensing requirements, given that you had just heard that Crown was making, as you put, all these changes to its systems?
Yeah, I believe that our direction, so I'll answer that in two parts. The direction around the junket operations was Crown had told us they were ceasing it themselves, and the advice from the staff was that it would be appropriate now to put a direction notice to them that they also cease. So we're taking their word that they're going to stop, and we're also putting it into effect that we're telling them to cease as well. But my understanding at that point was that junkets had ceased in any case because of COVID. There was no international travellers to Crown. So that was my understanding of that matter. And then the second matter in regards to the licensing requirements was in regards to them saying across their workforce they were increasing their training of their staff in identification of AML requirements. And from my recollection, we deemed it appropriate that that be formalised by way of policy from the GWC, that they take that. Again, so what effect those two resolutions are trying to do is cherry pick the parts out of Crown's presentation that we can amend and put into policy.
All right. Now, as you've explained, Crown was making these changes to its AML processes. Did you understand why it was that those changes were being made?
Do you mean in regards to the whole organisation, or just in regards to the parts that we...
So in regards to the presentation that you were hearing and that you had had Ms Koonan take you through and explain what was changing,
Yeah.
did you understand why it was that Crown considered changes were necessary?
Well, that was in the context of them having an inquiry in New South Wales, and they appeared to be getting on the front foot to make improvements to their business, I guess in anticipation of what was coming out of New South Wales.
And in terms of what might be coming out in the New South Wales inquiry, did you at this time have an understanding as to what might emerge when that inquiry was completed?
No.
I'm going to ask now for a document to be called up, but can we please make sure that the public monitors do not display the document? It's gwc.0002.0016.0345. And again, can the public monitors be turned off, please? Thank you. All right, if we can please have pages 449 and 450 up side by side. And do you recognise this document as being one of the documents included in that pack that was provided to you the night before the meeting?
I don't recall if it was in the pack, it was in there, but I don't recall that exact text, no.
All right. You've explained to the Commission earlier that because you received it very late the night before a meeting, you only had a chance to skim it that evening.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have an opportunity to go back and read it more thoroughly once the meeting had been completed?
I didn't take that action.
Do you know whether any other GWC members may have read that after the meeting and then discussed it at a later date?
I'm not sure.
So you've never heard any other GWC members mention to you that they had read this document? No. You can see obviously that this is a letter from Mr. Ken Barton, and in the second paragraph of the letter he explains that Annexure A, amongst other things, advises as to the current status of the ILGA inquiry. Do you have that?
Yes, see that.
So if we can then go to Annexure A, please, which begins at page 451, and have 451 and 452 up side by side. Now, in relation to that second page of Annexure A, which is 452, you see there's a paragraph that starts, "We further note," above some dot points.
Yep.
Just take a moment to read that paragraph and those dot points.
Yep.
And you see there's some discussion there as to an inquiry into the Riverbank account.
Yes.
Now, again, this is 15 December 2020. As at that time, did you understand, or would you have understood, what was meant by the Riverbank account?
It didn't. I don't recall the context of that.
Do you now understand what is meant by the Riverbank account?
Yes.
But you're not sure if you would have at that time?
I don't recall, no.
Don't recall. The first dot point then explains that there's a report that's available and there's a date given in relation to certain transactions in that account.
Yes.
And then in the third dot point, there's also reference to another report in relation to its review of the issue of money laundering based on that earlier report. Do you see that? And then finally, paragraph below that, there's some discussion about voluntary provision of those reports. Do you see that?
Sorry, what paragraphs?
So this is the paragraph underneath the dot points,
Oh, yeah, sorry.
and there's a discussion about providing these reports to AUSTRAC.
Yeah.
What do you understand AUSTRAC to be?
The federal agency that regulates suspicious transactions, any transaction matching, and has responsibility for AML.
All right. Looking then at what is in that paragraph, what's your understanding as to the significance as to there being reports being made to AUSTRAC?
But it looks like Crown has taken action to clean the house up.
When you say clean the house up, what would be being cleaned?
Well, they've identified issues that they need to report to AUSTRAC, and there's responsibilities for deposit takers and all the range of people that play in that space. Crown is one of those, and they have responsibilities to report matters when it comes across them to AUSTRAC. That's my understanding of that scope of that legislation from my other professional career. But Crown looks like they've done the right thing and identified those concerns and reported it.
All right. Now I'm going to ask that we go next to some pages which show the executive summary of some of these reports. I understand from discussions with my friend that that's suitable, but please let me know if I stray into an area which is a problem for Crown. If we can please go to page 461. And you can see here, obviously, the summary of the report. And if you look at the third paragraph, it explains an analysis of certain cash deposits. less than $10,000, what do you understand, if anything, to be the significance of cash deposits of less than $10,000?
Well, they're not reported to AUSTRAC unless they repeat transactions that are suspicious.
And then if we go to page 462, there's a summary of observations. And the table at the top is headed potential structuring activity. What do you understand, if anything, to be meant by structuring?
The timing of their deposits.
And do you have an understanding as to why structuring might be used by a person in making deposits?
Data matching and reporting.
And then the second to third last dot points, which I think is, if we can minimise the screen again. There's some discussion there about the total of the number of patrons identified in this potential structure transactions. And if the page can be raised a little bit, there's also a discussion as to the total percentage of cash deposits that were assessed as forming part of potential structuring. Again, appreciating that you didn't look at this at the time, but looking at this now, what do you understand to be conveyed by those top two dot points in the report?
They identified 52 people who were doing suspicious transactions.
If we can then now please bring up the next report, which is at page 512. And towards the bottom of the page, there's a paragraph that commences money laundering through, and then there's two dot points beneath that. Do you have that? Just have a moment to read that through.
Yes.
And then if we can now please look at the bottom three paragraphs of the page. So starting at section 142 on the third to last paragraph.
Yep, read it.
You've read that entire section?
Yep.
What it says there in relation to structuring in and itself being a criminal offence and therefore being suggestive of anti-money laundering activity, money laundering, is that something which coincides with your own understanding prior to reading that paragraph?
It's talking about that they've identified that it's a breach of section 142 and they're reporting it, and they've explained what they've observed in terms of the structuring. That's how I take those sentences to read.
And then if we go to the top of page 513, and again there's a discussion here in that third paragraph as to what cuckoo smurfing is. Have you heard that expression before, cuckoo smurfing?
Not prior to this report.
So back as at 15 December 2020, this wouldn't have been something that you had previously encountered?
No.
Is this something that was at all raised or talked about by the Crown executives in the course, as best as you can recall, in the course of their presentation?
I don't recall them getting into the operational aspect of how these money laundering offences occurred.
All right, and then if we go now please, the third paragraph from the bottom of this page, reading Initialism's review of the activity, and I'll just let you read that as well.
Yes.
And so, again, in terms of your understanding of what that is telling the reader, what do you understand that to be saying?
Initialism have done a review of the accounts and determined that there is the structuring and cuckoo smurfing, and that's done by their review of the deposits under the 10k threshold.
Okay, now going back please to page 462 of this report. And looking there at the second table, which is headed Total Potential Structuring Activity by Calendar Year, what do you understand to be suggested by that table as to the times at which potential structuring was taking place?
Primarily occurred between 2013 and 15.
And again, do you recall, to the best of your recollection, whether this detail was disclosed to the GWC board in that presentation that you've previously told the Commission about?
I don't recall that.
Do you recall whether the presentation was perhaps as blunt as is what's being put in this table, suggesting that there is an indication of structuring occurring? Do you recall whether it was expressed in terms such as that at the presentation?
No, I don't recall that.
Do you recall whether there was any direct statement to the effect that Crown believed there may have been money laundering occurring at that presentation?
I don't recall.
When that meeting concluded on 15 December 2020, if you can recall what your mindset at that stage was, did you then understand that there was evidence that suggested that there had been money laundering in these accounts?
I don't know if that was part of this paper, so I don't remember if I had that opinion or not at the end of that meeting. But I think there was an understanding within the Commission that these sort of incidents had occurred. Whether that data was, or that data and that level of forensic information was provided from Crown during that report, I don't recall, but the Commission had concerns about it.
And when you say the Commission had concerns, is that a concern that something may have been happening, or that you were concerned that something had happened? And by something, I'm talking about money laundering.
Past tense.
Okay. Are you aware of whether, following the receipt of this information, the GWC provided any update or information to the Minister as to what information had been received?
I don't recall.
And having been provided by Crown with this information that we've now gone through in some detail, you've told us that the steps that were taken were essentially to wait for the ILGA inquiry to conclude.
Yes.
Do you consider that your view would have been any different as to what would the appropriate next step be if you'd had the opportunity to review these documents in the same level of detail that we've just reviewed them now at the time of that 15 December 2020 meeting?
I don't believe the action would be any different because they were historical matters and we were waiting for a report to be finalised that gave us the basis for our advice from that point.
Thank you, Commissioners. Those are the questions I had for this witness.
Thank you. Mr Dharmananda,
No, thank you, Commissioner.
is there anyone that...
Mr Burson for the department. Commissioner, just one quick query from Mr Dobson. Mr Dobson, do you recall Councillor Sisting asking you questions about the quality of the discussions in GWC meetings?
In a broad sense,
Yes, and I think you described them as robust. There was a two-way conversation and you referred to requests for information made at those meetings.
yes.
And were those requests of departmental officers?
I believe they would be.
And those departmental officers would then answer the requests for information either at the meeting.
If they were questions they could take on notice, they'd answer at the meeting, and if they were questions that required preparation of information, then they would return out of sessions or at the next meeting the answers.
Thank you, Mr Dobson. No further questions, Commissioners.
Now, Mr Stolich, no questions?
No questions.
All right, thank you. Colin?
No,
Okay.
none.
Mr Dobson, I have some matters I'd like to raise with you. And I'll start with the one that I started on earlier. And just bear with me for a moment. I often find it useful when I'm confronted with a problem about, well, a problem that's arisen, or particularly, let's call it about a problem that's arisen in relation to the exercise of powers, to ask three questions. What, how, and why? What is the, what do we do? How do we do it? But why do we do it? Now, in your evidence in your statement is that when you got the call from the Minister's office saying you were under consideration for this position. You said you read or it may have been after, there was an indication to you that you would be appointed. You went to the website, you read the legislation, and you had a look at the annual reports. Can I put this to you, that much of that material, and we could go to it's all outlined in your statement, and we can go to it if you like, but may not be necessary. That much of that information is nuts and bolts. It's about the what we do and the how we do it, rather than the why. And I'll come to the why in a minute. Is that a reasonable statement?
I think that's fair.
Now let's come to the why. And it's a question of the what we do and the how we do it are not ends. They are means to ends. Would you agree with that?
Sorry, you've lost me on that one.
All right. You know the difference between means and ends. We say something's not an end in itself. It's a means to get to the end product to which you aspire.
Okay.
Right? Would you agree with me that what I've termed the nuts and bolts that you get from this legislation and what's in the annual reports and so on are more about the means rather than the end in itself?
Yeah, I'm still got to be. I'm going to be frank. I'm struggling to follow the line of questioning here. I don't understand. Yes, I get that there needs to be probably more clarity about what they're trying to achieve and to improve the regulatory environment of racing and gaming.
Young lawyers looking at this should never look at me as a role model as to how to ask questions.
I'm sorry, it's been a few hours, but I'm trying to get my head around what you're saying.
I'm coming to this question of strategy, and you can call it regulatory philosophy, the purposes and objects for which the system is in place. So the nuts and bolts, what I've called the nuts and bolts, are how you fulfil that strategy. And I want to talk about the strategy. I want to get your idea of the strategy because when you read the legislation, did you get a clear understanding of the why? What's this really all about? Why are we here? Why are we doing this?
I did. I had a feeling for what the nature of the work was going to be, which was to be in the space of improving, the regulation or the service delivery of business in those spaces, whether it be racing and gaming or TAB operations or Crown or 2-ups at Kalgoorlie. All those things appeared within the scope of what they were doing. I think what dawned on me post being involved in this is that where I've been involved in boards in the past, it was quite high level, and that is around those strategy, setting those objectives of what we're trying to achieve, whereas the statutes that form the basis of the Gaming and Wagering Commission are predominantly focused on operational matters and a lot more involvement from board members in those decision-making of operational matters.
I want to take you back to the period around July 2020 when you were first appointed. What was your understanding of what I call the why, the strategic objective, the regulatory philosophy, or the purpose and object for which we are regulating gaming and wagering, of course, but let's concentrate on gaming. What did you see as the elements of the regulatory philosophy?
I can't talk to the elements of the regulatory philosophy other than what I can read into it and what I read through the reports and information, and I guess what my own opinions are, having been a patron of Crown and other gaming venues in the past. And it was to be there as an agency that had regulatory focus, but also to ensure that the right things were being done by the people in that industry, knowing the history of it. So, and that knowing that casinos have only had a brief history in WA since the early 80s. So my understanding was that we would be more not a tick and flick as a board, because I hate that word, but boards should be presented the facts to make decisions from executive staff rather than, and I'll give you an example, as board members, a club that had breached their gaming licence would appear before us and accept questions and be in a sort of tribunal type environment. And as a board member, I don't think that's appropriate, and that would have been done by staff. So that's where some of these crossovers for myself are a challenge into what they actually do. To come back to your question about what are the whys, if I was told prior to accepting this role that I would be almost conducting an inquiry and having members of the public running poker nights at bowling clubs come and present before us and take questions, I probably wouldn't have accepted this role. It's not what my job is as a director, a professional director.
Well, can I put it to you this way? Another witness answered a question of the type that I've just put to you about the why, the regulatory purpose, the objects and purposes, this way, that it is in essence a public interest or community interest function. That's why you regulate these things,
yes,
in the public interest and the community interest. And there are three elements to it. One, fairness, to make sure that a patron who goes in to play a game, say the electronic gaming machines or the roulette table, that person can have confidence that the game is being played according to the rules that have been set. That's the first element. The second element is harm minimisation. And the third element is the question of the suitability of that person or that entity to have a licence to conduct those functions. How does that strike you as a description of the regulatory philosophy as you understood it and gleaned it from the acts you read?
I think that's a quite fair synopsis of the role of the board members, that we would do those as in the best interests of the users of the gaming machines, but also in respect to how the overplay of government regulation in that space works, and making sure that the government is giving a return on investment, because essentially they have a licence for Crown and they have a licence for TABs and those other activities.
And if we can come to the middle one of those three that I've mentioned, which is harm minimisation, what do you understand by harm minimisation in the public interest?
So that would be, the blight of people that have gambling addictions, and assisting those people who do have those addictions to be given appropriate treatment options, or to be removed from establishments that allow that problem gambling to continue. And I think that's an enormously important role that the GWC and some of the related trust accounts that are formed through the GWC have to continue that relationship with other not-for-profit providers to help those people that do come across that addiction. And
are there any other elements that go into harm minimisation in the public interest that you can see?
Well, there'd be multiple. It's a pretty broad beast. There's a whole range of elements there in terms of how that could be dealt with.
Would it include minimising the opportunities for criminality within the operations of the organisation?
Yes.
Okay. I'm interested in the comment, the answer that you gave to Mr. Lee about the lack of discussions between board members outside the confines of the meetings, and you said it wouldn't be proper to do that. Is that not something that you've seen in other organisations in which you've been involved, that there are interchanges between members outside the meeting structures?
For sure, that occurs, and it depends on what the nature of the discussions are. That may well occur between other members, but I hold a philosophical point of view that it's best to have all the parties at the table for the discussion. And I don't like silos occurring or people forming power bases prior to having chats about matters. And I've seen that from grassroots community not-for-profits where that can occur. Call it purple circles. So I don't like that behaviour. And if I'm a chairman, I encourage people to include all parties for discussion. So if there was like an example is that email about the Ernst Young, that would be an example of discussion between meetings. And the appropriate way to go about it is to put an email to all the members identifying my concerns rather than pick up the phone and ambush them one by one with my opinion.
But might it not also be the case that where there are complex and technical matters that you might not understand, that you may have a particular board member that you think does have expertise in that area, and you might contact them and say, what's this really all about?
Yeah, I think that would be appropriate in that circumstance because that's really clarifying a matter rather than discussing it or forming an opinion on the matter with collusion. I would say that if you rang up a board member, and whether it's in this board or any other board, and asked additional information, that's a fair approach.
So in that sense, would you reconsider your answer that it wouldn't be proper to have these discussions outside board?
I'm happy to reconsider that answer. Yeah.
If I can come back to my regulatory philosophy question, has anything of the type that I mentioned, that is looking at, well, what does the public interest really require of us as a board? Has there, in your time on this commission, has there been any discussions of that nature?
I think to answer that, the board is always acting in the public's interest about when we're looking at decision-making framework. I don't know that the word, what would the public think, as that saying has come up as such, but we're always thinking what's the perception of the public, what would the pub test, so to speak, be of this matter. That's going through the directors' heads as their reasoning process. I've got no reason to have doubts on the other directors' mindset on that. It seems there's always commentary about, well, if we did this, that would be the impact of that for the community. So those conversations have occurred.
I'm not sure that the pub test really is what I'm asking you, though, because the pub test is really how will this impact?
Yeah.
But the question is more on the notion of the public interest and the reasons why you have these powers to regulate and to intervene. Has that ever been discussed?
Yes, it has.
In what context?
Well, I guess this whole inquiry into that started into Crown was the first example of that. Into community gaming, there's continual examples of that are brought by staff to our consideration of where there's been issues in community gaming, and I'm happy to give an example of that where we've discussed that through. But certainly in the scope of the Crown inquiry and I guess our own preempting of what was coming out of New South Wales, we will continue as a board having those discussions about what our powers are, what we should be doing and what we should be looking at. But the guidance was that we would be waiting until the inquiry from New South Wales gave their findings, and then from there we would have a paper or a position ready to go.
Turning to a different topic, in your calling as a financial planner, you would be aware of the concept of ongoing professional development.
Yes.
Do you see a role for ongoing professional development for board members, members of the Commission?
I definitely would, yes.
Has that ever been discussed?
It hasn't, no.
Beg your pardon?
It has not.
Right. I think that covers what I wanted to ask. Anything arising from that, Mr. Lee?
No, thank you, Commissioner.
Right, Mr. Sadler? All right, thank you. Now, Mr. Dobson, were you in the room when I read that statement out earlier this morning? So you understand that that I can't release you from the effect of the summons. We hope it won't be necessary to call you back, but there may be questions that we will pose in writing. Thank you very much for your evidence. It's been of great assistance to us. Thank you, and we'll adjourn until 2 p.m.